Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation explores historical accounts of death, disease, and burial practices that may be disturbing to some audiences. In the frozen heart of a New England winter in 1892, a man named George Brown took a shovel and began to dig. He wasn't digging for treasure or for a new well. He was digging into the grave of his own daughter, Mercy. The town of Exeter, Rhode Island, was dying. A plague they called consumption was stealing the breath from their families, one by one. It had taken George's wife. It had taken his eldest daughter. And now it had taken 19-year-old Mercy. But as the town wasted away, a terrifying whisper took root. This was no ordinary disease. This was the work of the undead. A vampire was feeding on the living from beyond the grave. And the townspeople believed the monster was one of the Browns. So on that bitter March morning, George Brown and a group of neighbors unearthed his daughter's coffin. What they found inside would ignite a panic that became the last great vampire scare in American history. While the other bodies were decomposed, Mercy's was not. Her cheeks held a flush of life, and when they cut into her chest, they found liquid blood pooled in her heart. For the terrified farmers of Exeter, this was all the proof they needed. They performed a ritual so ancient and so brutal it feels alien to the modern world. They cut out Mercy Brown's heart and liver, burned them to ash on a nearby rock, and mixed those ashes with water. Then they fed the horrific tonic to her ailing brother, Edwin, in a desperate attempt to break the vampire's curse. This wasn't Transylvania in the 15th century. This was the United States of America, a nation of telegraphs and steam engines, on the doorstep of the 20th century. What primal, deep-seated terror could drive a community to this? What ancient fear could compel a father to desecrate his own child's remains in such a gruesome way? This story isn't an anomaly. It is an echo of a fear so old, it's woven into the very fabric of human civilization, a fear that began long before castles and counts, in the dust of our oldest cities. And the real mystery isn't whether vampires are real. It's why, for thousands of years, we have desperately needed them to be. To find the answer, we have to leave the cold soil of New England and travel back over 4,000 years, to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, in the world's first cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, the nights were filled with terrors we would recognize today. They didn't call them vampires. They had other names, names that dripped with dread. They spoke of the Lilitu, winged demons who stalked the darkness, preying on pregnant women and newborn infants, stealing their life force. They weren't charming aristocrats. They were monstrous, terrifying specters born from the fundamental human anxieties of childbirth and infant mortality in a world without modern medicine. And then there was the Akimu. This was something even more sinister. The Akimu was not a demon, but the vengeful spirit of a person who had been buried improperly, denied their final rites. This ghost could not rest. It was doomed to wander the earth, consumed by a jealous rage for the life it had lost. It would slip into the homes of the living, latching onto a victim and slowly, night after night, draining them of their vitality until they wasted away and died. Sound familiar? The ancient Mesopotamians believed this was a literal affliction. When a person fell sick with a mysterious wasting illness, what we might now diagnose as anemia or cancer or tuberculosis, their doctors and priests saw the work of an Akimu. They didn't have microscopes, they had mythology. And naming the terror was the first step to fighting it. They created intricate rituals, spells, and amulets, not to cure a disease, but to exorcise the thirsty, clinging dead. This is the absolute bedrock of the vampire legend. The terrifying idea that the dead do not always stay dead, and that they might return, not with love, but with a ravenous hunger for the life they left behind. As civilization spread, so did this shadow. We see it emerge again in ancient Greece, where it took on new and seductive forms. They told stories of the Empusa, a demonic phantom sent by the goddess Hecate. It could shapeshift, often appearing as a beautiful woman to lure young men traveling alone on dark roads. Once she had them in her thrall, her true monstrous form would be revealed as she devoured their flesh and drank their blood. The Empusa was a cautionary tale, a boogeyman designed to keep young men on the straight and narrow path, a terrifying explanation for why a traveler might vanish without a trace. Even more famous was Lamia, a queen of Libya who, according to myth, was cursed by the goddess Hera. Her own children were killed, and in her madness and grief, she was transformed into a child-eating monster. Lamia became the ultimate nightmare for every parent, the monster that lurked just outside the firelight, waiting to snatch away a sleeping infant. Greek parents would invoke her name to frighten their children into obedience. She was the monster under the bed, the original bogeyman, a creature born of tragedy and transformed into a tool of social control. The Romans inherited these fears and gave them their own uniquely grim spin. They whispered of the striges or strix. These weren't seductive phantoms. They were grotesque, bird-like creatures of the night with giant heads, unblinking eyes, and sharp beaks. They were said to disembowel their victims and feast on their organs, but their preferred meal was the blood of infants. The cry of an owl in the night was considered a terrifying omen. The sound of a strix hunting. When a baby died suddenly in its sleep, what we now call sudden infant death syndrome, the grieving parents could find a terrible supernatural explanation for their loss. It wasn't a random tragedy. It was the work of the strix. Again, the monster provided an answer, however horrifying, to the unanswerable pain of the human experience. The Romans also had a deep-seated fear of their own dead returning. They called these malevolent spirits the lemurs. These were the restless, unsatisfied dead. Much like the Mesopotamian Akimu, to the Romans this wasn't just a story. It was a clear and present danger that had to be dealt with through ritual. Every year, they held a festival called Lemuria. For 3 nights, the patriarch of the family would rise at midnight, and while making protective signs with his hands, he would walk barefoot through the house, throwing black beans behind him and chanting 9 times, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." The rest of the family would then clash bronze pots together, shouting, "Ghosts of my fathers, be gone!" This was a full-blown, state-sanctioned exorcism, performed in every household to drive the hungry dead back to their graves for another year. From the plains of Mesopotamia to the hills of Rome, a clear pattern emerges. These early blood drinkers and life-stealers were not a single, coherent myth. They were a collection of our most primal fears, given a face and a name. They were the personification of plague, the explanation for stillbirths and crib death, the reason for the traveler who never returned home. They were the embodiment of the terrifyingly thin veil between the living and the dead. These ancient demons, spirits, and shapeshifters were the scattered DNA of a monster yet to be born. They were the archetypes, the rough drafts, but for them to coalesce into the singular, iconic figure we know today, the human corpse that climbs from its own grave to stalk the night, it would take a perfect storm of history, disease, and superstition in a very specific part of the world. The vampire was about to get a promotion, from a wandering demon to your next-door neighbor. And that is where the true terror begins. To understand this transformation, you have to place yourself in a world lit only by fire and fear. Imagine you live in a small, isolated village in 17th century Eastern Europe. Your world is a tiny circle of light carved out of a vast, dark forest. The church is your shield, the community your strength. But death is everywhere. It comes with the winter cold, with a failed harvest, with a fever that sweeps through the cramped, smoky huts where families sleep huddled together for warmth. Death is a constant, familiar neighbor. But there are different kinds of death. There is the good death, at home, surrounded by family, with last rites given by the priest. The soul departs, the body is consecrated in holy ground, and the story ends. But then there is the bad death, the unclean death. This is the key. The central fear that gave birth to the Slavic vampire, the Yupper or vampire, wasn't a fear of bats or aristocrats. It was the fear of an improper end. In the complex tapestry of Slavic pagan and Christian belief, it was thought that humans possessed 2 souls. One was the pure soul that ascended to the heavens after a good death. The other was the shadow self, the spirit double, the part of you tied to your physical body and earthly life. When a death was unclean, a suicide, an unbaptized infant, a victim of a violent crime, someone excommunicated from the church, that shadow self could become trapped, couldn't move on. And a trapped soul, festering with resentment and a desperate hunger for the life it lost, becomes a dangerous thing. It remains anchored to its corpse, a corpse that is now an unholy vessel. The list of potential triggers was terrifyingly long and mundane. Was the deceased a sorcerer, a drunkard, or just an unpopular outcast? They were a prime suspect. Did a cat or a dog jump over the corpse before it was buried? A terrible omen, a sure sign the body was now a potential host. Was the person born with a caul, a reddish membrane over their head? They were marked from birth. This wasn't a monster that came from a faraway castle. This was your uncle, your sister, the quiet farmer from the edge of the village who died angry. The terror was intimate. It came from within the community itself. So, how did they know the dead were walking? It didn't start with a dramatic attack in the night. It started quietly, insidiously. After the funeral of a suspected unclean soul, a strange sickness would begin to spread, but only among the relatives of the deceased. A family member would grow weak, pale, complaining of nightmares and a crushing weight on their chest at night. Soon they would waste away and die. Then another, and another. In a pre-scientific age, with no concept of contagion or communicable disease, this pattern pointed to only one horrifying conclusion. The dead one was not at rest. They were rising from the grave, returning to their home not for a joyful reunion, but to drain the life force from those they once loved. It's not your blood they want, not at first. It's your vitality, your breath, your energy. They are feeding on the life of their own family to sustain their unnatural existence. When the fear and the body count grew too high, the villagers, led by their priest and local elder, would take the only action they could. They would become a mob, armed with shovels and iron spikes, and march to the cemetery. They were going to dig up the dead. This moment, the exhumation, is the grotesque heart of the original vampire legend. What they were looking for were the infallible signs of vampirism, and what they found, through a tragic misunderstanding of human decomposition, was all the proof they needed. They'd pry open the coffin of a body buried weeks or even months before, and instead of finding a clean skeleton, they'd find a horror. The corpse wasn't skeletal and dry. It was bloated, swollen, with a dark, ruddy complexion. To them, this wasn't the result of gases building up in the abdominal cavity. It was proof the creature had been feasting, gorging itself on the life of its kin. They saw blood staining the lips and burial shroud. They didn't know this was just putrid, liquefied organ tissue being forced up through the mouth by the pressure of the gas. They saw a monster caught red-handed, fresh from its nightly meal. They'd see that the hair and fingernails appeared to have grown longer, not understanding that this was merely the skin retracting after death, creating an illusion of growth. The body was incorrupt. It had defied God's natural law of decay. It was undead, and sometimes the final damning proof would come. As one of the villagers, trembling with fear and religious fervor, thrust a sharpened stake of hawthorn or ash wood into the corpse's chest, the body would let out a terrifying groan or a sigh. That sound, the release of trapped gases from the torso, was interpreted as the shriek of a demon being vanquished. It was all the confirmation they needed. Once confirmed, the disposal was a brutal, ritualistic affair designed to ensure the monster could never rise again. A simple stake wasn't always enough. First, the body would be pinned to the earth with the stake. Then, the head would be severed with a gravedigger's spade. For extra security, the mouth would be stuffed with garlic or a brick, and the severed head would be placed between the corpse's legs, so if it somehow reanimated, it could never find its own head to reattach. Finally, the ultimate purification, fire. The entire gruesome package, body, head, and blood-soaked coffin, would be piled onto a pyre and burned until nothing remained but ash. The curse was broken. The plague would cease. The village was safe, until the next bad death. This wasn't just folklore. It was practice. For centuries, this was the reality in countless villages across the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And in the year 1725, in a small Serbian village called Kisilova, this local terror was about to go international. A peasant named Petar Blagojevic died. Within 10 weeks, 9 other villagers, including his own son, fell mysteriously ill and died, each claiming on their deathbed that Blagojevic had come to them in the night and throttled them. The terrified villagers demanded action. They went to the local imperial provisor, an official of the Austrian administration that controlled the area, and begged for permission to exhume the body. The official reluctantly agreed, and what he witnessed would be written down in an official report that would shock the capitals of Europe. The report, titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Reported, describes the scene with bureaucratic precision. It notes that Blagojevic's body showed no odor of decay, that his hair and beard had grown, and that fresh blood was visible at his mouth. When the villagers staked the body, the report states that a great quantity of fresh blood flowed from his ears and mouth. This wasn't a ghost story whispered around a fire. This was an official government document, filed by a representative of the Habsburg Empire. This report, and others like it that would soon follow, began to circulate among the educated elite in Vienna, Paris, and London. Philosophers of the Enlightenment, men of science and reason, were suddenly confronted with meticulously documented accounts of the undead from the wild frontiers of their own continent. They scoffed, they debated, they ridiculed, but they were also fascinated. The local ghoul from a Serbian village was about to step onto the world stage. The collision between peasant superstition and Enlightenment reason wouldn't kill the vampire. It would give it a new and far more powerful form of life. The year is 1732. A man of science and reason, an Austrian army surgeon named Johannes Fleckinger, arrives in the Serbian village of Medvedja. He's been sent by the authorities in Vienna to investigate a series of bizarre and terrifying deaths. The local peasants are in a panic. They speak of a plague, but not one of disease. They speak of a plague of the dead. They tell him about a man named Arnold Pole, a soldier who returned from the Greek frontiers years ago, haunted by a terrifying encounter with a Turkish vampire, of Vrikolakas. Pole believed he had been cursed, and though he tried to cure himself, he died in a farming accident a few years later. But his death, they said, was not the end. Within a month of his burial, people in the village began to die. They complained of exhaustion, chest pains, and a pale sickness. On their deathbeds, they claimed Arnold Pole had returned from the grave to torment them in their sleep. The villagers, acting on ancient tradition, dug him up, and what they found horrified them. Pole's body was, in their words, quite complete and undecayed. Fresh blood stained his mouth, his nose, his ears. His hair and nails had grown. He was not a corpse. He was an undead. They drove a stake through his heart, and he reportedly let out a terrible groan as fresh blood gushed from the wound. Then they burned his body to ash. Fleckinger, the enlightened surgeon, likely listened to this story with a healthy dose of skepticism. This was the age of reason. Such tales were the stuff of peasant folklore, of dark, uneducated corners of the empire. His job was to dispel these myths, to find a rational explanation, a contaminated well, a localized disease, mass hysteria. He was there to bring the light of science to the darkness of superstition. But then the dying started again. 17 more people had died in a matter of weeks. The villagers claimed that Pole hadn't been the only one. He had preyed on their livestock, and those who had eaten the tainted meat had now risen as vampires themselves. The panic was so extreme, the villagers were threatening to abandon their homes and land entirely if the authorities didn't act. So Fleckinger, along with a contingent of army officers, went to the graveyard. He was there to document, to dissect, to debunk. What he recorded in his official report, a document titled the Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, would change everything. It was not a dismissal. It was a cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying confirmation of what the peasants had claimed. He describes the exhumations one by one. The body of a woman named Milika, dead for 3 months, found with fresh blood in her chest cavity. The body of a young boy, dead for 2 months, still perfectly preserved. And another and another. Fleckinger and his team methodically examined the corpses. They noted the lack of decomposition, the presence of what they called new skin and new nails, and the state of the blood inside the bodies, not coagulated and dry like a normal corpse, but liquid and fresh, as if the person were still alive. The report details, with the detached language of a medical examiner, how the local gypsies, the so-called vampire hunters, decapitated the bodies and burned them, throwing their ashes into the river. Fleckinger wasn't just an observer. He was a participant in the process, documenting the staking and destruction of 17 suspected vampires. This report was sent back to Vienna, and it was a bombshell. This wasn't a folktale whispered around a village fire. This was an official military document, signed by an army surgeon and other officers, men of standing and education. It described, in meticulous detail, physical evidence that seemed to defy all known laws of nature. The Visum et Repertum was leaked, and it went viral 18th century style. It was translated, reprinted in newspapers and scholarly journals across Europe. From Vienna to Berlin, Paris to London, the educated public was suddenly confronted with what appeared to be irrefutable scientific proof of vampires. The word itself, vampire, a Slavic term, exploded into the Western European vocabulary. For the first time, the English, the French, the Germans had a specific name for this specific monster. The reaction was a firestorm of debate. The greatest minds of the Enlightenment were forced to weigh in. The French philosopher Voltaire scoffed at the idea, writing with his signature wit, "What? Vampires in our 18th century? Are there still revenants? Are we still to be frightened by the tales our grandmothers told?" He sarcastically noted that the real bloodsuckers weren't the dead in their graves, but the living stockbrokers, merchants, and monks who drained the public dry. But the very fact that Voltaire had to address it showed how powerful the story had become. He was trying to laugh it out of existence, but the public was too fascinated. The clinical, almost believable details of Fleckinger's report were too compelling. Other scholars tried to offer rational explanations. A French monk and biblical scholar, Dom Augustin Calmet, compiled a massive treatise on the subject. He didn't outright endorse the existence of vampires, but he meticulously gathered every report he could find, from the ancient Greeks to the recent events in Serbia, presenting them with an air of scholarly gravity that only lent the topic more credibility. He was fascinated by the question, could God allow such a thing? Doctors and early scientists scrambled to explain the phenomena described in the Visum et Repertum. They argued that the undecayed state could be caused by certain soil conditions, or the lack of oxygen in a coffin. The fresh blood could be a byproduct of decomposition gases forcing bloody fluid out of the mouth and nose. The groan when staked? Air being violently expelled from the lungs. Premature burial was another popular theory. Perhaps these people were simply being buried alive in a catatonic state. Each theory was an attempt by the rational mind to contain the monster, to lock it back in the box of the explainable. But for every explanation, there was a counter-argument. For every skeptic, there was a believer holding up Fleckinger's report as proof. The vampire was no longer just a monster. It was an intellectual crisis. It was a battleground between faith and reason, science and superstition, the ancient world and the modern one. The vampire epidemic became so notorious, so disruptive to public order, that it eventually demanded the attention of the highest authority in the land, the Holy Roman Empress herself, Maria Theresa of Austria. This wasn't just about folklore anymore. It was a matter of state. Her subjects were digging up graves, desecrating bodies, and abandoning their villages in terror. It was a public health crisis and a challenge to the centralized authority of her government. So in 1755, she dispatched her personal physician, a brilliant and highly respected Dutch doctor named Gerard van Swieten. Van Swieten was the embodiment of the Enlightenment, rational, empirical, and deeply skeptical. His mission was to travel to the troubled regions of Moravia, conduct his own investigation, and put an end to the matter once and for all. Van Swieten was thorough. He exhumed bodies himself. He interviewed witnesses. He studied the soil, the burial customs, the local diseases. And his conclusion was unequivocal. In his report, Discourse on the Existence of Ghosts, he systematically dismantled the vampire legend. He explained the lack of decomposition as a natural process, citing examples of bodies preserved by cold, damp soil. He attributed the stories of the dead attacking the living to local epidemics of contagious disease, combined with the nightmares and anxieties of a terrified populace. He declared the entire phenomenon to be the result of a disordered imagination and ignorant fear. Based on his findings, Empress Maria Theresa passed laws forbidding the exhumation and desecration of graves. The state officially outlawed vampire hunting. The Austrian government had spoken. Vampires do not exist. Case closed. But it wasn't. The official decree could stop the digging, but it couldn't erase what had been unleashed. For 30 years, Europe had been obsessed. The vampire had been discussed in royal courts, debated in academic societies, and sensationalized in the penny press. The official reports, the eyewitness accounts, the lurid details, they were all now part of the public record, lodged deep in the European consciousness. By trying to kill the vampire with laws and science, the Enlightenment had accidentally given it a promotion. It had lifted the creature out of the shallow graves of peasant folklore and placed it onto the grand stage of Western culture. The vampire was no longer just a village problem. It was an idea, a powerful, terrifying, and deeply seductive idea. And it was waiting in the wings, ready for a new kind of creator, not a priest or a peasant, but a poet, a novelist, an artist, to give it a new and far more immortal body. The stage was set, not in a plague-ridden village or a forgotten graveyard, but in the drawing rooms and salons of a Europe teetering on the edge of a new age. The 18th century, the age of reason, had tried its best to kill the vampire. Philosophers like Voltaire had sharpened their wits and aimed them squarely at the heart of what they saw as peasant superstition. When news of the so-called vampire epidemics in places like Serbia reached the West, tales of exhumed bodies, undecomposed and bloated with blood, of stakes and decapitations, the intellectual elite scoffed. They wrote essays, they debated, they dismissed it all as the sad, predictable result of ignorance and fear. And they were, in a way, correct. But they missed a crucial point. You can't kill a story with logic. You can't reason a nightmare away. While the philosophers were busy debunking, the artists were listening. The horrifying reports from the Austrian Empire's eastern frontier, detailing the cases of Arnold Paulet and Peter Plagajowicz, became not just medical curiosities, but something far more potent, inspiration. The gruesome details, the fresh blood on the lips of the dead, the groans from the grave, were too vivid, too visceral to be forgotten. The idea of the vampire didn't die under the harsh light of the Enlightenment. It simply retreated into the shadows of the imagination, waiting. It was waiting for a storm, and in 1816 it got one. A storm that engulfed the entire world. They called it the year without a summer. Half a world away in Indonesia, the volcano Mount Tambora had erupted with a force 100 times greater than Vesuvius, spewing a colossal veil of ash into the stratosphere. This veil circled the globe, dimming the sun, plunging temperatures, and unleashing a torrent of climatic chaos. Crops failed, famine spread, and in Europe, the summer of 1816 was a season of unending twilight, of relentless, chilling rain, and of violent, spectacular thunderstorms that ripped across the sky. It was the perfect setting for the birth of a monster. On the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, four of the most brilliant, radical, and scandalous minds of the age were trapped together inside a rented mansion, the Villa Diodati. There was the 24-year-old Percy Bysshe Shelley, a genius poet and notorious atheist, ostracized from polite society. With him was his 18-year-old lover, the fiercely intelligent Mary Godwin, daughter of two of history's most famous radical thinkers. And then there was their host, the man who was, at that moment, the most famous person in the world, the 28-year-old poet Lord Byron. Byron wasn't just a writer. He was a phenomenon, a celebrity in the modern sense. He was impossibly handsome, aristocratic, brooding, and trailed by rumors of shocking scandal, debt, debauchery, and dark whispers of an incestuous affair with his half-sister. He was the original rock star and the world was his stage. Completing this volatile quartet was Byron's personal physician, a young, ambitious, but deeply insecure man named John Polidori, who both idolized and bitterly resented the lord he served. For days on end, the rain lashed against the windows of the villa, imprisoning them. To pass the time, they read from a collection of German ghost stories. And then, on one particularly dark and stormy night, Byron issued a challenge. We will each write a ghost story. That night, a creative fire was lit that would change literature forever. Percy Shelley tried and gave up. Byron began a story, then grew bored and abandoned it. But Mary Godwin, plagued by a waking nightmare, conceived of a tale about a brilliant student who creates a monstrous, living being from the parts of the dead. She would, of course, go on to write Frankenstein, a masterpiece that gave the world its first great modern myth. But another monster was born in that villa. One that crawled not from a laboratory slab, but from the pages of a discarded manuscript and the depths of a bitter rivalry. Remember Byron's abandoned story? It was just a fragment, a sketch. It told of a wealthy, world-weary English aristocrat named Augustus Darville. While traveling in the East, Darville mysteriously sickens and dies. Before he passes, he makes his traveling companion swear a bizarre oath, to conceal his death, and to return to a specific spot near an ancient ruin 1 year later. The implication was clear. Darville would somehow return from the grave. Here was the seed. A nobleman connected to death and resurrection traveling the world. But Byron lost interest. He tossed it aside. John Polidori did not. Polidori saw everything. He saw Byron's casual genius, his magnetic charm, his cruelty. Byron would mock Polidori's medical knowledge, belittle his writing ambitions, and treat him like a glorified servant. Day by day, Polidori's admiration curdled into a potent mix of jealousy and rage. He saw the way women and men alike were drawn to Byron's dangerous orbit, often to their own ruin. He saw a man who seemed to feed on the emotional energy of everyone around him, leaving them drained and discarded in his wake. And in Byron's abandoned story fragment, Polidori saw his chance for the ultimate literary revenge. He took Byron's aristocratic corpse, Augustus Darvel, and he breathed a new venomous life into it. He took the essence of Lord Byron himself, the charisma, the seduction, the predatory nature hidden beneath a veneer of refined society, and he poured it into his creation. He named him Lord Ruthven, and in doing so John Polidori created the first modern vampire. Published in 1819, his short story, The Vampire, was an absolute sensation. It tells the story of a naive young gentleman named Aubrey, who is completely captivated by the mysterious, charming Lord Ruthven. They travel through Europe together, and Aubrey is horrified to discover Ruthven's true nature. Ruthven is a predator who moves through high society, targeting the innocent and the virtuous. He seduces Aubrey's beloved, the beautiful Ianthe, and drains her of her blood, leaving her a pale corpse. He is a monster who doesn't lurk in graveyards. He attends balls and waits in drawing rooms. He doesn't kill with brute force. He kills with a cold, calculated charm, destroying not just the body, but the soul and reputation of his victims. This was the quantum leap. This was the moment the vampire put on a tuxedo. Gone was the shambling, bloated, mindless Naxxerer of Slavic folklore. In its place stood a figure of immense power and terrifying allure. Lord Ruthven was everything the old vampire was not. He was handsome, intelligent, articulate, and wealthy. He was a social predator. His bite was not just an attack. It was a violation, a dark seduction that carried the thrill of the forbidden. He was a direct reflection of the anxieties of a new era, the fear of the decadent, predatory aristocrat who could ruin a family's fortune and a daughter's virtue with a whisper and a smile. Polidori had fused two powerful ideas into one immortal being. He took the ancient, blood-drinking ghoul from folklore and merged it with the contemporary archetype of the Byronic hero, the dark, brooding, and dangerously attractive outcast that Byron himself had perfected. The result was electrifying. To add insult to injury, the story was initially published under Lord Byron's name. The public went wild, believing their favorite celebrity bad boy had penned this dark, revealing tale. Byron was furious and publicly denied it, but the scandal only made the story more popular. Polidori had, for a fleeting moment, beaten Byron at his own game, using his own persona against him. He had created a template, a blueprint for a new mythology. He established the tropes that we now consider essential to the vampire legend. The aristocratic bearing, the hypnotic charm, the targeting of a specific victim, the ability to move unseen through the highest echelons of society. He turned the vampire from a thing you run from in a graveyard into a thing you might unwittingly invite into your own home. John Polidori had opened Pandora's box. He had unleashed a new kind of monster onto the world, one perfectly suited for the modern age. A monster that was not only to be feared, but perhaps in some dark corner of the heart to be desired. The vampire was no longer just a story whispered by peasants around a fire. It was now literature, and it had found its definitive shape. The pale, dark-eyed stranger whose kiss promised both ecstasy and eternal damnation. The foundation was laid. The coffin was built. And now, all the creature needed was for its greatest, most iconic master to arrive and take his throne. That master's name was not Varney. It was not Lord Ruthven. It was a name that would echo through the dark corridors of history and horror. A name plucked from the blood-soaked soil of Eastern Europe. A name that was very, very real. The name was Dracula. And the man who would give him eternal life, or rather eternal undeath, was an unassuming Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker. Stoker was no Gothic aristocrat scribbling away in a castle. He was the business manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London, working for the most famous actor of the age, the brilliant, domineering, and utterly magnetic Henry Irving. For decades, Stoker lived in Irving's shadow, managing his affairs, answering his mail, and absorbing his larger-than-life personality. He saw firsthand how a single man could command a room, how charm could be a weapon, and how a hypnotic gaze could hold thousands in thrall. He was taking notes, perhaps without even realizing it. He had the personality for his monster, the charisma, the aristocratic bearing, the hidden menace. He just needed a history. He needed a name. And then during a summer holiday in 1890, he found it. In a dusty library, he stumbled upon a book about Wallachia and Moldavia, regions of modern-day Romania. The book made a passing reference to a 15th-century prince, a voivode who fought against the Ottoman Empire. His name was Vlad III. But he was known by another name, a title passed down from his father, who was a member of a knightly order called the Order of the Dragon. In Romanian, son of the dragon is Dracula. The name itself was perfect. It sounded ancient, powerful, alien. But as Stoker dug deeper, he discovered the name was attached to a man whose cruelty was so profound, it had already become the stuff of legend. This wasn't just a prince, this was Vlad the Impaler. Forget the fanged fiends of fiction. The real Vlad Dracula was a monster of flesh and blood, a ruler whose entire political and military strategy was built on the foundation of absolute, paralyzing terror. His preferred method of execution gave him his infamous nickname. Impalement was not a quick or merciful death. It was an agonizing, meticulously engineered spectacle of suffering designed to last for days. A sharpened stake, often oiled, was carefully inserted to avoid piercing vital organs immediately, using the victim's own weight to slowly, horribly, drive it up through their body. And Vlad didn't do this to a few traitors in a dark dungeon. He did it on an industrial scale. After one major battle against the Ottomans, the invading Sultan Mehmed II, a conqueror who had seen the worst of medieval warfare, was greeted by a sight so horrific he turned his army around and retreated. It was a man-made forest, a grotesque landscape stretching for miles, where 20,000 captured Turkish soldiers, men, women, and children, were impaled, their decaying bodies left for the crows. This was Vlad's psychological warfare. He wasn't just defeating his enemies, he was erasing their humanity and turning their own bodies into a monument of his wrath. The stories that swirled around him were even more chilling. Tales were told of him dining amongst the forest of the impaled, dipping his bread in the blood that dripped from his victims, of him boiling people alive, of nailing the hats of foreign envoys to their heads when they refused to remove them in his presence. To his own people, he was a brutal but just ruler, a national hero who defended his homeland. To his enemies, he was the devil incarnate. For Bram Stoker, reading these accounts in the quiet comfort of a British library, this was it. This was the historical bedrock he needed. He had found the savage, blood-drenched soul for his creature. But Stoker never once set foot in Transylvania. Everything he wrote about that land of misty mountains and superstitious peasants came from his research. He became an armchair traveler, devouring maps, travelogues, and history books in the British Museum. His most important source was a book by a Scottish writer named Emily Gerard, The Land Beyond the Forest. It was here he found the local folklore he needed to flesh out his creation. Gerard wrote of the Romanian belief in ghosts and goblins, of the strigoi who rise from their graves. And crucially, she recorded a specific word used by the peasants to describe the undead: Nosferatu. The word itself was likely a misunderstanding of a Romanian phrase, but to Stoker it sounded sinister, ancient, and authentic. He had the location. He had the folklore. He had the name. Now the final act of creation could begin. Stoker began to synthesize. He took the historical monster, Vlad the Impaler, and stripped him of his Christian cause, leaving only the cruelty and the ancient aristocratic bloodline. He grafted onto this brutal figure the captivating, hypnotic personality of his boss, Henry Irving, the charm that masked a will of iron. He then dressed this new being in the clothes of his literary predecessors, Lord Ruthven's aristocratic seduction and Varney the vampire's supernatural powers and nocturnal habits. He placed him in a castle in a land he'd only ever visited in his imagination, a Transylvania built from maps and folklore. And then, Stoker infused the creature with the deepest anxieties of his own time. The Victorian era was a period of immense social change and repressed fear. There was a terror of reverse colonization. The idea that the primitive peoples the British Empire had conquered would one day come to the heart of London and conquer it from within. Dracula, arriving in England on a ship full of coffins filled with his native soil, was the literal embodiment of this fear. He was the foreign contagion, the ancient evil invading the modern scientific world. He also represented a terrifying, unrestrained sexuality that the buttoned-up Victorian society desperately tried to suppress. Dracula's bite is not just an act of violence. It is an act of perverse intimacy, a dark baptism that transforms his victims, particularly women, from prim and proper ladies into wanton, predatory creatures. He was a threat to the bloodline, not just by drinking blood, but by corrupting it, turning good English women into his undead foreign brides. For 7 years, Bram Stoker worked on his novel, originally titled The Undead. He wove together real history, borrowed folklore, personal obsessions, and societal fears. He created a story told through letters, diary entries, and newspaper clippings, a modern-feeling narrative that made the impossible feel terrifyingly real. He wasn't just writing another penny dreadful. He was conducting a grand symphony of terror, pulling threads from 1,000 years of human fear and weaving them into a single perfect predator. He had created a king of the night, a creature with the mind of a warlord, the charm of an actor, and a thirst born from the darkest corners of European history. He had given him a name. He had written his Bible. And in 1897, Bram Stoker was about to open the coffin lid and unleash his creation upon an unsuspecting world, changing the definition of horror forever. The world of 1897 was a world of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. It was the pinnacle of the Victorian era, a time of steam, steel, and telegraph wires shrinking the globe. Science was king, mapping the world, dissecting the atom, and promising a future of perfect, rational order. London was the undisputed capital of the largest empire the world had ever known, a city of gaslight, progress, and unwavering faith in its own civilized superiority. But beneath this gleaming surface of logic and empire, a deep primal anxiety festered. This was also the age of Jack the Ripper, of dense, choking fogs that hid unspeakable things, of spiritualism and seances held in respectable parlors, a desperate attempt to contact a world beyond the cold, hard facts of science. It was a society obsessed with etiquette and public morality, which only served to conceal a churning abyss of repressed desire and forbidden thoughts. The Victorians feared many things, but their greatest fears were often unspoken. They feared degeneration, the idea that their civilized society could decay and slide back into barbarism. They feared the foreign, the other, the strange customs and beliefs from the dark, unmapped corners of their own vast empire. And they feared sexuality, especially female sexuality, as a chaotic, destructive force that threatened to tear down the carefully constructed walls of their patriarchal world. Bram Stoker, a theater manager living in the heart of this contradictory age, understood these fears intimately. He saw the crack in the veneer of civilization, and into that crack he poured a monster. Dracula was not just a scary story. It was a Trojan horse, smuggling every single one of those Victorian anxieties into the reader's home, disguised as a Gothic romance. Stoker's genius was not in inventing a monster from scratch, but in his masterful synthesis. He took the historical ferocity of Vlad the Impaler, the seductive danger of Polidori's Lord Ruthven and Lefanu's Carmilla, the shambling horror of Eastern European folklore, and filtered it all through the anxieties of his time. He created the ultimate predator for the modern age. Notice where Dracula comes from. Not from some familiar part of Europe, but from the East, from the furthest edge of the map, a wild, superstitious land of mountains and wolves that time had forgotten. To the British reader, this was the frontier, the place where civilization ended and barbarism began. Dracula's journey to London is a story of reverse colonialism. The empire, which had for so long been sending its sons out to conquer and civilize the world, now faced a terrifying invasion from one of those dark places, a creature coming to conquer and corrupt them from within. He buys property. He learns the language. He plans to walk among them unseen, a plague in a gentleman's suit. And look at who he preys upon. The story begins with Jonathan Harker, a solicitor, a man of timetables, contracts, and logic. He is the quintessential modern man, and he is utterly, pathetically helpless against the Count's ancient power. His reason, his laws, his very sense of reality crumble in the face of something so impossible. Stoker is making a powerful statement. Your modern world, your science, your logic, it cannot save you. It is a fragile shield against the true darkness that lies beyond. To fight this ancient evil, Stoker creates the perfect counter-hero, Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Van Helsing is not just a scientist. He is a doctor, a philosopher, and a metaphysician. He represents a fusion of the old and the new. He uses the most modern tools of the age, blood transfusions, phonograph diaries, but he also understands the power of ancient lore. He knows that to fight a vampire, you need more than a scalpel. You need a crucifix, a wooden stake, and the sacramental host. He is the only one who can bridge the gap between the rational world of his friends and the supernatural abyss that has opened up to swallow them. But the most potent fear Stoker exploited was the fear of sex. The vampire's bite in Dracula is a thinly veiled metaphor for the act of seduction, a violation that is both terrifying and perversely tempting. It is a transfer of blood, a mingling of fluids, an act of intimate, soul-stealing penetration. And its effect on women was what truly horrified the Victorian readership. Consider Lucy Westenra. She begins the novel as the ideal Victorian woman. Pure, chaste, and beautiful, sought after by 3 respectable suitors. But after Dracula's visitation, she undergoes a monstrous transformation. She becomes voluptuous, wanton, and sexually aggressive. Her own fiancé describes her post-vampire state with horror, saying her sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and her purity to voluptuous wantonness. She preys on children, the ultimate perversion of the maternal instinct. This was Stoker tapping directly into the male fear of the new woman, the emerging independent woman who challenged traditional gender roles and embraced her own sexuality. For a Victorian man, the vampire Lucy was the ultimate nightmare. A woman freed from all social and moral restraint, a creature of pure predatory lust. Stoker's choice of structure was another stroke of genius. The novel isn't told by a single narrator. It's an epistolary novel, a collection of documents, journal entries, letters, telegrams, newspaper clippings, and phonograph recordings. This makes the story feel terrifyingly real, as if you've stumbled upon a case file, a dossier of a real horrific event. It creates a fractured, breathless sense of suspense. We, the readers, are the only ones who see all the pieces at once. We watch in horror as the characters struggle in the dark, trying to assemble a puzzle whose terrible picture is already clear to us. It was the found-footage horror film of its day, a technique that immersed the reader completely in the mounting dread. And at the center of it all was the Count himself. Stoker codified the vampire, creating the definitive blueprint for the next century and beyond. His Dracula was no mindless, shuffling ghoul from a peasant's tale. He was an aristocrat, a nobleman of immense intellect, cunning, and ancient lineage. He was a warrior, a strategist, a creature of immense personal power and hypnotic charm. Stoker gave him a specific set of powers and weaknesses that have become legendary. He has the strength of 20 men. He can command the wolf and the bat, control the fog and the storm. He can vanish into mist or crawl down castle walls like a lizard. And Stoker gave him limitations, the rules of the game. His aversion to garlic and the crucifix, his inability to cross running water on his own, his need to be invited into a home, and the fatal power of the sun. For the first time, all the scattered pieces of folklore were assembled into one coherent, terrifying whole. When it was published in 1897, Dracula was not the instant, earth-shattering phenomenon we might imagine. It was met with good reviews. Critics called it highly sensational and powerfully imagined. It sold well, but it was simply considered a very effective, very chilling horror novel. Stoker had successfully synthesized the fears of his age into a single iconic monster. He had created the modern vampire, but the creature was still trapped, bound between the pages of a book. Its true reign of terror, its ascent from literary monster to global icon, had not yet begun. For that to happen, the Count needed to break free from the printed word. He needed a new medium, a new technology that could give his shadow form and his horror a flickering, mesmerizing life. The age of the novel was ending, and the age of the cinema was about to dawn. The vampire was waiting in the wings, ready for his close-up. That flickering light was a new kind of magic, a silent, ghostly medium that could capture dreams and nightmares alike, projecting them 100 feet high in darkened theaters for a new mass audience. And in the ashes of the Great War, the world was filled with nightmares, especially in Germany, a nation defeated, humiliated, and haunted by the ghosts of millions. It was here, in the unstable, artistically explosive Weimar Republic, that the vampire would be reborn, not as a seductive aristocrat, but as a primal force of terror. This was the age of German Expressionism, a movement that cared nothing for reality. It sought to paint the inner world, the anxiety, the paranoia, the madness, directly onto the screen. With distorted, knife-like sets, painted-on shadows, and actors who moved like broken puppets, these filmmakers created a waking nightmare etched in silver nitrate. And in 1922, director F.W. Murnau unleashed the masterpiece of this movement, Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. It was an unauthorized, pirated adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Murnau knew he couldn't get the rights, so he simply changed the names. Count Dracula became Count Orlok. London became Wisborg. But the story was unmistakable, and Bram Stoker's widow Florence was furious. She sued the production company for copyright infringement, and she won. The court ordered that every single copy of Nosferatu be found and burned. A cinematic execution. For decades it was believed the film was lost forever, a ghost story in its own right. But a few prints had been secretly smuggled out of Germany, circulating like a forbidden text. The vampire, it seems, refuses to die. And what a vampire it was! Max Schreck's Count Orlok was a complete and total rejection of Stoker's suave nobleman. This was not a creature you'd invite into your home. This was a pestilence. With a bald, egg-like head, pointed ears, and long rat-like incisors dead in the center of his mouth, Orlok looked less like a man and more like a walking plague. He didn't glide. He lurked. His fingers were unnaturally long, like the legs of a spider, and his body was stiff, corpse-like. Murnau had stripped away the Victorian veneer of sexuality and aristocracy, and returned the vampire to its foulest folkloric roots. This was the Naxxerer of German myth, the Shroud Eater, the Plague Bringer. He is explicitly linked with rats, his coffin filled with unhallowed earth and his arrival in the city coinciding with a wave of death. In a world still reeling from the Spanish flu pandemic, which had killed more people than the war itself, this was not a metaphor. This was a raw, exposed nerve. Murnau understood that the true power of cinema wasn't just in what you see, but in the suggestion of what you cannot. He made Orlok a master of shadows. In the film's most iconic, most terrifying sequence, we don't see the monster himself ascend the stairs to claim his victim. We see his shadow, a black, distorted silhouette with hooked claws, creeping up the wall, independent, alive, a physical manifestation of dread. It is one of the most powerful images ever put on film. The shadow, the thing that is both there and not there, the darkness that follows us. With Nosferatu, the vampire became pure, distilled horror. A celluloid ghost that would haunt the dreams of cinema for the next century. But this grotesque, European vision of the undead was not the one that would conquer the world. For that, the vampire had to go to Hollywood. Across the Atlantic, America in the Roaring '20s was a different world. It was a place of glamour, optimism, and rising power. And its new movie industry was building gods. Universal Studios, seeing the success of horror films in Europe, decided to create their own brand of monster, but it had to be done the Hollywood way. They legally acquired the stage rights to Dracula, and they didn't want a rat-faced creature of the night. They wanted a star. They wanted a monster with box office appeal. They found him in a Hungarian actor who had already made the role his own on the Broadway stage, Bela Lugosi. When Todd Browning's Dracula hit theaters in 1931, it was an absolute sensation. And it couldn't have been more different from Nosferatu, where Murnau's film was a dreamlike silent poem of dread. Browning's was a talkie, filled with crackling dialogue and a chilling, deliberate atmosphere. And at its center was Lugosi. He was everything Max Schreck was not. He was handsome, elegant, dressed in a tuxedo and a flowing cape. He moved with a dancer's grace. And that voice, that slow, deliberate Hungarian accent became the definitive voice of aristocratic menace. When he leaned in and told a character, "I never drink wine," a legend was born. Lugosi's Dracula was the personification of a different kind of fear. Not the fear of disease or vermin, but the fear of the foreigner. The sophisticated, exotic stranger with hypnotic eyes and strange, old-world customs who could charm his way into your home and corrupt your daughters. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also alluring. He was a predator, but a seductive one. His power was not in his grotesque appearance, but in his hypnotic gaze, a power emphasized by Browning with extreme, unnerving close-ups of Lugosi's eyes, a trick that terrified audiences of the day. This was Stoker's vision, filtered through the Hollywood machine. The violence is almost entirely off-screen, the horror implied. The sexuality, however, is palpable. This Dracula was a creature of forbidden desire, a dark romantic figure who offered eternal life, at a terrible price. The success of Dracula was monumental. It saved Universal Studios from bankruptcy and kicked off the Universal Classic Monsters franchise, creating a cinematic universe of horror that included Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and the Wolfman. But its most important legacy was cementing a specific type of vampire in the public consciousness. For the next 40 years, almost every vampire that appeared on screen, from a B-movie villain to a serial mascot, was in some way an imitation of Bela Lugosi. The cape, the widow's peak, the accent, it all became a standard, almost a cliché. The raw, pestilent horror of Orlok was driven back into the shadows, deemed too extreme, too ugly for mainstream audiences. The vampire had been tamed, packaged, and turned into a Hollywood icon. And so by the 1930s, the cinematic vampire was born with a split personality. A war was being waged for its soul. In one corner you had the beast, the silent, monstrous, plague-ridden ghoul of European folklore, a creature of pure nightmare. In the other you had the aristocrat, the suave, talking, seductive predator of Hollywood, a creature of dark romance. For decades, the aristocrat would reign supreme, his appearances governed by Hollywood's strict production code, which limited how much horror could actually be shown. The vampire was a gentleman, and gentlemen had to follow the rules. But rules are made to be broken. And as the world changed, as color film arrived, and as a rebellious new generation of filmmakers in Britain decided that horror should be horrifying, the blood was about to start flowing again. This time it would be in vibrant, terrifying color. The gentleman was about to get his hands dirty. And get his hands dirty he did. Blood red. Technicolor red. For the first time, audiences would see the bite, the puncture, and the crimson result in shocking detail. The gentleman was dead. Long live the predator. This bloody revolution began not in Hollywood, but in a small, unassuming British studio called Hammer Film Productions. By the mid-1950s, the old Universal monsters felt quaint like Gothic fairy tales. Post-war Britain was a different world, a place shedding its stiff upper lip, and a new generation of moviegoers was hungry for something with more bite. Censorship was loosening, and Hammer saw an opportunity. They secured the rights to the classic monsters and made a calculated decision to remake them not as shadowy phantoms, but as visceral flesh and blood threats. In 1958, they unleashed horror of Dracula, and with it, they unleashed an actor who would redefine the vampire for all time. Christopher Lee. Where Bela Lugosi was hypnotic and otherworldly, a creature of shadow and suggestion, Christopher Lee was a physical force of nature. Standing at a towering 6'5", he didn't need to glide. He commanded every room he entered. His Dracula was an aristocrat, yes, but beneath the veneer of nobility was a barely contained animal fury. When he descended the grand staircase in his first appearance, he wasn't a host. He was a panther surveying his prey. His movements were swift, decisive, and terrifyingly strong. This wasn't a vampire who would mesmerize you from across the room. This was a vampire who would slam you against a wall, tear open your throat, and drink his fill while you watched the life drain from your own eyes. And the fangs. For the first time, the vampire had prominent, sharp canine teeth. The bite was no longer a delicate, almost invisible peck on the neck. It was a savage, carnal act. Lee's snarl as he pulled back his lips to reveal those teeth became one of the most iconic images in all of horror cinema. He brought a raw, masculine energy to the role that was both terrifying and, for many, deeply attractive. This Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was a dark, forbidden fantasy. He represented a dangerous sexuality that the buttoned-up 1950s were both terrified and fascinated by. In fact, Lee famously had very little dialogue in the sequels, relying almost entirely on his sheer physical presence, his piercing stare, and that predatory hiss to convey everything. He proved that true terror doesn't need to explain itself. But a monster of this magnitude requires an equally formidable hero. And Hammer gave Dracula his ultimate adversary in Peter Cushing's Dr. Van Helsing. This wasn't the aging, slightly eccentric professor from the novel. Cushing's Van Helsing was a man of science and a man of action. He was sharp, intelligent, and utterly relentless. He was Sherlock Holmes with a stake and cross. The films became a thrilling chess match between two brilliant opponents, Lee's primal evil versus Cushing's intellectual righteousness. Their on-screen chemistry was electric. They were great friends in real life, and that mutual respect translated into some of the most dynamic hero-villain confrontations ever filmed. Van Helsing wasn't afraid. He would leap across tables, fashion crosses out of candlesticks, and dive through windows to escape the Count's wrath. He treated vampirism not as a supernatural curse to be feared, but as a disease to be studied, understood, and eradicated. He was the perfect foil for Lee's Dracula, a beacon of logic and order against a tide of chaotic, ancient evil. This dynamic, the intelligent, proactive hunter against the powerful aristocratic vampire, became the new template, copied and emulated for decades to come. Together, Lee and Cushing were the twin pillars of the Hammer horror formula. But the secret ingredients that made it a global phenomenon were sex and gore. Hammer films were drenched in atmosphere, but they traded the subtle shadows of German expressionism for the rich, lurid colors of a Gothic romance novel come to life. The sets were opulent, filled with deep reds, lush velvets and ornate decorations. And into these settings, they placed their Hammer glamour actresses. The female victims in Hammer films were a far cry from the chaste, swooning damsels of the 1930s. They were beautiful, voluptuous, and often clad in low-cut nightgowns. And crucially, their reaction to the vampire's bite was complicated. It was portrayed as a horrific violation, but it was also filmed with an undeniable erotic charge. The bite was a moment of terrifying intimacy, of forbidden ecstasy. The victim would arch her back, her eyes would roll, a mix of pain and pleasure on her face. Hammer took all the sexual subtext that Stoker had woven into his novel and made it the main event. The vampire was no longer just a threat to your life. He was a threat to your virtue, a dark seducer offering an immortal, sensual existence in exchange for your soul. It was scandalous, it was titillating, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. And then there was the blood. That bright, almost theatrical Kensington gore, as the proprietary fake blood was known. When Dracula was staked, he didn't just fade to dust. He writhed, he screamed, he decayed on screen in a horrifying spectacle of crumbling flesh and bone. The climax of Horror of Dracula is a masterclass in action horror. Van Helsing, trapped and cornered, makes a desperate leap, tears down the heavy curtains, and allows a shaft of morning sunlight to strike the Count. Lee's agonizing disintegration, his face turning to dust before our very eyes, was a sequence of special effects so shocking and graphic for its time that it burned itself into the nightmares of a generation. Hammer produced 7 Dracula films starring Christopher Lee, and while the quality varied, their impact is undeniable. They cemented the image of the vampire in the popular consciousness as a tall, dark, fanged aristocrat in a cape. They established the tropes: the hunter armed with knowledge and faith, the seductive and vulnerable victim, the final violent confrontation between good and evil. For nearly 20 years, Hammer's Dracula was the Dracula. But by the early 1970s, the world had changed again. The sexual revolution that Hammer had helped foreshadow was now in full swing. The Vietnam War was showing real horror on the nightly news. Society was growing more cynical, more questioning of authority. The old Gothic formula, with its clear lines between good and evil, started to feel predictable. A monster in a remote castle, preying on women in nightgowns, seemed less frightening in a world grappling with serial killers, political assassinations, and social upheaval. The vampire, ever the chameleon, knew it was time to evolve once more. The era of the aristocratic predator was drawing to a close. The monster needed to shed his skin, to leave the crumbling castles of Europe behind and walk among the mortals he hunted. He needed to become more complex, more relatable, even sympathetic. The vampire was about to experience an identity crisis, and in doing so, he would become more human and infinitely more dangerous. This new vampire couldn't just be a monster. He had to be a gentleman. He had to trade his dirt-caked claws for tailored gloves, his guttural snarls for silver-tongued persuasion. The first creature to truly step out of the grave and into the ballroom was born not in the misty mountains of Eastern Europe, but in the stormy imagination of a group of English aristocrats on holiday. The year was 1816, the year without a summer, and a young doctor named John Polidori was traveling with the infamous poet Lord Byron. Trapped indoors by volcanic ash-choked skies, they passed the time by telling ghost stories. From this gloomy gathering, Mary Shelley would conceive of Frankenstein, but Polidori, inspired by the dark, brooding, and predatory charisma of his employer Byron, created something else entirely. He created Lord Ruthven. In his short story, The Vampire, Polidori unleashed a creature the world had never seen. Lord Ruthven was handsome, mysterious, and moved effortlessly through the highest circles of London society. He was an aristocrat whose ancient lineage was matched only by his ancient evil. He didn't just drain blood. He drained fortunes, ruined reputations, and destroyed innocence with a cold, calculating precision. He was a social predator, using his charm as a weapon, making his victims complicit in their own destruction. He was the first vampire to make undeath look appealing. For the first time, the monster wasn't just something to be feared. He was something to be desired. This was a seismic shift. The vampire was no longer just a threat to your life. He was a threat to your soul, your morals, your very identity. He wouldn't break down your door, you would invite him in. This aristocratic fiend was too delicious a concept to remain in a single short story. As the 19th century roared on, the printing press made literature cheap and accessible to the masses. An explosion of sensationalist serials known as penny dreadfuls flooded the streets of London, and they needed a recurring villain. They found him in a creature named Sir Francis Varney. Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, was a sprawling, chaotic epic published over 2 years, and it introduced a new, crucial element to the vampire's psyche: regret. Varney was a monster, to be sure. He terrorized families, his eyes burned with a hypnotic fire, and he left a trail of pale victims in his wake. But unlike the purely malevolent Lord Ruthven, Varney was tortured. He was cursed. He loathed his condition, frequently bemoaning the cruel fate that forced him to commit his horrific acts. He was a predator who wept for his prey. This was the birth of the sympathetic vampire, the tragic anti-hero. Readers were horrified by him, but they also pitied him. This internal conflict, this war between the man he once was and the monster he had become, made him terrifyingly relatable. It suggested that the monster wasn't just an external force, but a darkness that could exist within anyone. The vampire now had a backstory, a motivation beyond simple hunger. He had a tormented soul, and that made him infinitely more compelling. But why then? Why did the 19th century become the vampire's golden age? Because the Victorian era, for all its outward piety and obsession with progress, was secretly terrified. It was an age of profound anxiety, and the vampire became the perfect vessel into which they could pour all their deepest fears. First, there was the fear of disease. The Victorians lived in the shadow of an invisible killer, tuberculosis, or as they called it, consumption. It was a plague that hollowed people out from the inside. The symptoms were chillingly familiar: a ghastly pallor, a wasting sickness, sunken eyes, and most horrifically, coughing up blood. When a family member died of consumption, it often seemed as if they continued to drain the life from their surviving relatives, who would sicken and die in turn. In the absence of germ theory, it looked exactly like a supernatural predator was feeding on the family, one by one. The vampire wasn't a fantasy. For many, he was a folk explanation for the very real monster already in their homes. He was the personification of contagion itself. Then there was the fear of the other, the foreigner. The British Empire was at its peak, but with that came a deep-seated anxiety about the corrupting influences of foreign lands. The vampire was often depicted as a nobleman from a distant, mysterious, and morally suspect part of Europe. He was an invader who brought his ancient, decadent evil to the shores of civilized England. He was a parasite, feeding on the lifeblood of the nation, a symbol of xenophobia given fangs. He represented the fear that their society, for all its industrial might, was vulnerable to ancient darkness it couldn't understand or control. But perhaps the most powerful fear of all was the fear of desire. Victorian society was famously repressed, bound by a rigid code of conduct that suffocated passion and sexuality. The vampire was the ultimate taboo breaker. He was sensuality and violence wrapped in a dark romantic package. The vampire's kiss was a thinly veiled metaphor for a sexual act, an intimate, penetrating, and transformative exchange that left its victim forever changed. It was a union of pleasure and death, ecstasy and horror. It represented a complete loss of control, a surrender to primal animalistic urges that the Victorians tried so desperately to deny. The vampire didn't just drink blood. He awakened the forbidden passions lurking beneath the starched collars and tight-laced corsets. He was everything they secretly craved and publicly condemned, and this predator was not exclusively male. As the century progressed, a new and arguably more subversive figure emerged from the shadows: the vampiress. In 1872, the Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, a Gothic masterpiece that predated Dracula by a quarter of a century. Carmilla was not a rampaging monster or a brooding aristocrat. She was a young, beautiful, and languid woman who preys on the lonely young heroine Laura. Her method of attack is not brute force, but slow, seductive intimacy. She comes to her victims in the night, offering whispers of love and devotion, her caresses mixing pleasure with a faint, sharp pain in the neck. Carmilla was a terrifying figure for the Victorian mind, because she represented a double threat. She was a predator, But she was also a woman who subverted all expectations of female purity and passivity. Her seduction of Laura was an unmistakable depiction of lesbian desire, a concept so taboo it was practically unspeakable. She was a threat not to the body, but to the natural order of society itself. Carmilla proved that the monster could wear a beautiful face, that the most dangerous predator could be the one you welcomed into your bed as a friend, a confidant, a lover. By the late 1800s, all the pieces were in place. The vampire was no longer a simple reanimated corpse. He was a complex tapestry of society's deepest anxieties. He was an aristocrat of impeccable taste and a monster of insatiable appetite. He was a tragic, cursed figure who hated his own existence, and a cold, calculating predator who reveled in destruction. He was the embodiment of foreign contagion and the personification of repressed, forbidden sexuality. He could be the suave, predatory man who charms you at a dinner party, or the beautiful, languid woman who whispers to you in your dreams. The folkloric ghoul had been buried, and in his place stood a sophisticated psychological horror, perfectly tailored to a modern age. The stage was set. The world was waiting for a master to gather all these terrifying threads and weave them into the single, definitive, and eternal king of the night. And that master's name was Abraham Stoker. An Irish theater manager and author, Stoker was not a literary titan in his day. He was a hard-working man fascinated by the occult and deeply immersed in the Gothic atmosphere of his time. For 7 years, he meticulously researched, pulling from a vast array of sources. He devoured travelogues of Eastern Europe, particularly Emily Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest, which gave him the word Nosferatu and vivid descriptions of Transylvanian superstitions. He studied the clinical accounts of hysteria and madness. He absorbed the seductive, predatory nature of Le Fanu's Carmilla, and he almost certainly borrowed the aristocratic bearing from Varney the vampire. But he needed a historical anchor, a name that would echo with real-world terror. He found it in a footnote, a brief mention of a 15th-century Wallachian prince, a voivode who fought the Ottoman Turks with legendary cruelty. His name was Vlad III, Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, but he was better known by another name, Vlad the Impaler. Stoker had found his king. He fused the historical sadism of a medieval warlord with the supernatural traits of the Slavic folk monster and the refined menace of the Victorian literary vampire. The result was a monster unlike any the world had ever seen. In 1897, Dracula was unleashed. The novel's genius wasn't just in its monster, but in its telling. Written as a collection of journal entries, letters, and newspaper clippings, it created a suffocating sense of realism. It felt like an unfolding catastrophe documented by its victims. We travel with the unsuspecting Jonathan Harker into the heart of a decaying, superstitious land. We feel the walls of the castle close in, a prison of ancient evil. We witness the Count's unnatural power, his control over beasts, his terrifying strength, his ability to crawl down walls like an insect. Stoker didn't invent all the rules, but he codified them, turning scattered folklore into a definitive vampire Bible. He established the core weaknesses: the sacred power of the crucifix and holy wafer, the purifying scent of garlic, and the final violent release of a stake through the heart. He introduced the expert, the knowledgeable warrior against the dark, Abraham Van Helsing, a man of both science and faith, representing humanity's rational and spiritual defense against the irrational unknown. Count Dracula himself was a terrifying synthesis of all the fears we've explored. He was the ancient demon, a creature of plague and pestilence, arriving in England on a ghost ship with boxes of his native soil, literally a disease infecting the modern world. He was the foreign aristocrat, the old-world tyrant with hypnotic charm, seducing and corrupting the women of a supposedly civilized society. And he was a creature of profound, predatory sexuality. The scene with his 3 brides is a fever dream of forbidden desire and terror, a direct assault on Victorian repression. Dracula represented a total invasion, physical, spiritual, and sexual. Yet, for all its future fame, the novel wasn't an immediate sensation. It was a modest success. The monster's true dominion would begin not on the page, but on the stage, and then most powerfully on the screen. The first great cinematic vampire wasn't even named Dracula. In 1922, the German expressionist masterpiece Nosferatu haunted theaters. Due to copyright issues, the names were changed. Count Dracula became Count Orlok. But this was no charming aristocrat. Max Schreck's Orlok was a hideous walking plague. With his bald head, rat-like fangs, and long clawed fingers, he was the Eastern European folk demon brought to life, a creature of shadow, filth, and pestilence. He was fear incarnate. But it was 9 years later, in 1931, that the definitive image of the vampire was burned into the global consciousness. Universal Pictures released its official adaptation of Dracula, starring a Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi. Lugosi had already perfected the role on Broadway. With his thick accent, his slow, deliberate movements, and his intense hypnotic stare, he was utterly mesmerizing. He wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was the monster hiding in plain sight, invited into your drawing room. Dressed in a tuxedo and cape, he was the embodiment of dangerous foreign seduction. When he leaned in and uttered the line, "I never drink wine," an archetype was born. For decades, Lugosi was Dracula. His performance became the blueprint, copied and parroted 1,000 times over. The vampire had conquered Hollywood. Throughout the 20th century, he would continue to evolve. In the late 1950s, Britain's Hammer Film Productions resurrected the Count, casting Christopher Lee. Lee's Dracula was tall, imposing, and feral. He rarely spoke, communicating instead through his intimidating presence and explosive violence. This was a more physical, more overtly sexual predator. The blood was brighter, the fangs were longer, and the subtext became text. Then, in 1976, the vampire underwent its most profound transformation. Author Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire. For the first time, the story was told from the monster's point of view. The vampire was no longer a simple villain to be vanquished. He was now the protagonist, Louis, a tormented, tragic figure, cursed with immortality and a thirst he despises. We experienced his loneliness, his philosophical anguish, his capacity for love and despair. Rice gave the vampire a rich inner life, turning him from a creature of fear into a figure of profound sympathy and gothic romance. The sympathetic anti-hero was born, paving the way for every tortured, brooding vampire to come. And so, we arrive back at our central question. Why? Why has this creature, born from the whisper of ancient spirits and the fear of unburied corpses, held us captive for millennia? The answer is because the vampire is the most adaptable, most potent metaphor humanity has ever created. It is a dark mirror, and in its reflection, we see all of our deepest, most persistent anxieties. It reflects our fear of death, and its seductive counterpoint, the desire for eternal life. The vampire offers an escape from the grave, but at a terrible price, an endless predatory existence. It reflects our fear of disease. From its folkloric roots in plague to its modern association with blood-borne illness, the vampire is contagion given a human face. The bite is a vector of transmission, turning the healthy into the sick, the living into the undead. It embodies our fear of the other, the outsider, the foreigner with strange customs and a hypnotic charm who threatens to invade our homes and corrupt our bloodlines. It taps into our primal fear of predation, the terror of being hunted by something that looks human, but is driven by an insatiable, inhuman hunger. And perhaps most powerfully, it is a vessel for our complex relationship with sexuality. The vampire's bite is the ultimate taboo, an act of violence and intimacy, of pain and ecstasy, of submission and domination. It represents the forbidden, the dangerous, the desire that society tells us to repress. The vampire is the monster that doesn't just want to kill you, it wants you. From the soul-stealing Echimus of Mesopotamia to the shrouded Vrikalakas of Greece, from the peasant-plaguing corpses of Eastern Europe to the suave aristocrat of the Victorian novel, from the rat-like monster of silent film to the hypnotic seducer, the brutal predator, and the tormented romantic soul, the vampire has never been one thing. It is a living, breathing myth that refuses to die because it constantly changes, shape-shifting to reflect the fears and desires of every new generation. It is not just a story of a monster that drinks blood. It is the story of our own relationship with life and death, with sickness and health, with faith and science, with fear and desire. The vampire is immortal, not because it cannot be killed, but because it is a story we will never stop telling. It is a story about us,